She should have noticed the way he held his teacup. That was the detail she missed, the one small thing that would have explained everything. The way his fingers wrapped around the cheap ceramic mug she handed him in her tiny apartment kitchen as though he were cradling something infinitely precious, with a patience and a gentleness that had nothing to do with the mug and everything to do with her. She would think about that teacup later, much later, in a different kind of room entirely, and she would understand that it was the first clue and the clearest one, and she had handed it to herself and walked right past it without stopping. But Elena Vasquez was not thinking about teacups on that particular drizzling Tuesday evening in November. She was thinking about rent, about the 12-hour shift she had just finished at the county hospital, about the blister forming on her left heel, and about the way Marcus had been distant lately, distracted, his eyes sliding past her toward some horizon she could not see. She was not thinking about the quiet man sitting at her kitchen table with the warm, dark eyes and the worn jacket who had shown up at the hospital volunteer desk 6 weeks ago, asking if there was anything he could do to help. She was not thinking about how he had come back the next day, and the day after that, and every day since, reading aloud to the elderly patients in Ward C, bringing handmade cards to the children in pediatrics, staying late without being asked, never once checking his phone. She was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about survival, which is what people with no safety net and blistered heels and distant fiancés are always thinking about. She had no idea that survival was about to become the least of her problems. She had no idea that in 36 hours, the world as she had constructed it, the careful, modest, hard-won world she had built brick by brick from nothing, would be taken apart completely, and then rebuilt into something so far beyond her imagination that she would stand in the center of it and feel like a woman reading a map of a country she had never heard of. She had no idea, on that drizzling Tuesday evening in November, that the quiet man with the worn jacket and the warm, dark eyes was going to change everything. She just handed him a cup of tea and sat down across from him and let the rain tap at the window while the city moved outside like it always did, indifferent and enormous, and she said, "You didn't have to come tonight." And he looked at her with that steady, unhurried look he had, and he said, "I know." And that was all, and it was enough, and neither of them spoke for a long time after that, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere across the city, Marcus was making a decision that would destroy everything and set everything free at exactly the same time. His name was Nico. She knew that much. Nico, who liked chamomile tea and terrible wordplay, and stayed until the last elderly patient was asleep, and the ward was quiet. Nico, who always wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation, and whose hands, she had noticed once during a shared shift, were unusually elegant. The hands of someone who had been trained in something precise and careful, though she could not have said what. They were not the hands of someone who had grown up doing nothing. They were the hands of someone who had grown up doing everything correctly and then stopped needing to perform it, and that was a distinction Elena could not yet name, but could feel the way you feel a draft through a wall without being able to locate the crack. Nico, who deflected questions about his family with such practiced warmth that you left those conversations feeling satisfied while somehow having learned absolutely nothing. She had asked him once, early on, where he was from, and he had smiled and said, "A small country," and she had laughed and said, "That's not an answer," and he had laughed back and said, "It's all the answer that fits tonight," and somehow that had been fine, somehow that had been enough, and she had not pressed, because Elena Vasquez had been raised to understand that some silences are held for reasons and deserve their space. She had, she would later reflect, been remarkably incurious. Or perhaps she had been precisely curious enough to sense that the answer was larger than she was ready for. It amounts to the same thing. She knew what she needed to know. She knew that when Marcus had stopped coming home for dinner 3 nights running, and she had sat alone at the table with her food going cold, it was Nico who had texted to ask if she was all right. She knew that when the water heater broke in February, and she had no money to fix it, and 2 days of cold showers ahead of her, it was Nico who had quietly arranged for a plumber without being asked, and refused any discussion of reimbursement, saying only that it was the least he could do for someone who worked the hours she worked. She knew that on the day her favourite patient, Mrs. Adeyemi, in room 14, finally lost her long battle, and the nurses cried in the break room, it was Nico who had brought flowers. Not for the staff, for Mrs. Adeyemi's empty chair. He had set them there and said nothing, and Elena had looked at him across the room and felt something shift in her chest like a tectonic plate, slow and enormous and irreversible. She had called Marcus that night to tell him about Mrs. Adeyemi, and he had said, and that's rough. And she had heard the television in the background, and something else she could not identify, a voice, a laugh, a frequency tuned to someone who was not her. She had hung up and sat with that for a long time. She had not cried, not yet. The crying came later, all at once, in a way that suggested it had been waiting very patiently for its moment. It was Priya who started it, technically. Priya, who had been Elena's friend since nursing school, who wore 3-inch heels to brunch and spoke in a rapid, conspiratorial whisper about things like social capital and strategic visibility, as though they were medical terms, as though the world were a body and status were the blood, and you had to keep it circulating or the whole system went into shock. Elena loved Priya in the way you love someone whose flaws are entirely unlike your own, which is to say with affectionate bewilderment and occasional exhaustion. It was Priya who called on a Saturday morning in March with the proposition that would upend everything, her voice pitched high with the particular excitement of someone who has acquired access to something she did not earn and cannot entirely believe. "The Harrington Gala," she said, and the way she said it suggested uppercase letters, italics, possibly a fanfare. "Miriam Chen is a personal friend of the host family, and she has 2 extra invitations, and she is giving them to us, Elena, to us. And before you say anything, yes, it's formal, yes, it's at Whitmore House, yes, it is absolutely beyond anything we have ever attended in our entire lives, and yes, you are coming." Elena had said, "I don't have anything to wear," which was true, and Marcus is away that weekend, which was also true and had landed differently than she expected, a small stone in a very deep well. Priya had said, "perfect," as though the absence of Marcus were an upgrade rather than an absence. Elena had let herself be talked into it. She spent 2 evenings altering a dress she already owned, taking in the waist, replacing the buttons, pressing it until it held its shape with a quiet dignity. It was a good dress. It was a dress that belonged to a person who took care of things. It was not a dress that belonged at the Harrington Gala, though she did not know that yet. This was a mistake. Not because she wasn't good enough for the Harrington Gala, because she was about to find out what not good enough looked like when people with money said it out loud. Whitmore House was the kind of building that made you feel the inadequacy of your own skeleton. It rose from the city's most coveted address in pale stone columns and gilded ironwork, lit from without by a wash of golden light that made the entire facade look like a stage set designed specifically to reduce you. The approach alone was a performance, a long circular drive lined with sculpted hedges trimmed to the millimeter, valets in matching charcoal moving with choreographed precision, the sound of a string quartet drifting through the cold March air like something designed to remind you that beauty exists in registers you have not been invited to occupy. The women arriving ahead of them wore gowns that moved like water and jewelry that caught light like small captured suns. The men wore black with the ease of people who had been taught from infancy that spaces like this existed for them. Elena wore the best dress she owned, which was midnight blue and perfectly lovely, and cost $140 on sale, and she walked up the marble steps behind Priya and felt herself begin to understand, in the wordless animal part of her brain, that she was in the wrong taxonomy. The hostess at the door was a woman named Claudette, perhaps 50, all collarbone and condescension, who scanned Elena with the kind of look that catalogues deficiencies. She was a woman who had perfected the art of the 2-second appraisal. Fabric, cut, label, posture, shoes, hair, judgment rendered, filed, complete. She held the invitation for a moment longer than necessary before returning it. She said, "Welcome to Whitmore House," in a tone that said nothing of the sort. It said, "I know exactly who you are and exactly who you are not, and this door opens for both categories, but only one of them should feel welcome passing through it." Elena understood every syllable. She smiled anyway. She had learned to smile at things that meant to wound her. It was the particular skill of someone who has never had the luxury of reacting. Inside, the champagne arrived in crystal that caught the chandelier light and shattered it into prismatic pieces, and the air was warm with perfume and old money and the specific ambient confidence of people who have never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. Elena held her glass and watched Priya evaporate into the crowd with the speed of someone who had found her habitat. And she was alone. She moved through the rooms. She smiled at people who looked past her. She admired, in the silent and private way of someone who has no stake in anything, the extraordinary quality of the flower arrangements, the museum-grade paintings hung with casual permanence, the guests who moved through it all as though beauty of this magnitude were simply the natural condition of Tuesday evenings. She paused at a window to breathe and looked out at the city below, at the lights and the dark and the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business 8 floors down, and she felt, for just a moment, the clean simplicity of belonging to that world rather than this one, and she almost let herself feel grateful. And that was when she heard it. Not the words immediately, but the laugh. A laugh she recognized. Low and easy and belonging to someone who had never once in her presence laughed at anything that was not genuinely funny. She turned, and across the room, between 2 marble pillars framing a window that looked out on the winter garden below, was Marcus. He was standing very close to a woman in red. The woman in red had the kind of beauty that requires maintenance and money and several loyal professionals, and she wore it with the casualness of someone who has never had to think about it, because the infrastructure has always simply been there. She was laughing with her whole face turned towards her, and he was looking at her the way he had not looked at Elena in 2 years, maybe longer, maybe ever, leaning in with the particular posture of a man discovering something rather than maintaining something. And Elena watched his hand come to rest at the small of the woman's back with a proprietary ease that said not beginning, but continuation. Not here. Not tonight. Before. Elena stood at the window for a very long time. The champagne in her glass went flat. The quartet played something from another century. Around her, the room sparkled and murmured and went about the pleasant business of itself, completely indifferent to the fact that something was ending in its midst. And then Priya materialized at her elbow and said in a low, furious hiss that Marcus was there with Vivian Alcott, shipping heiress, 3rd on the Forbes list of inheritors under 40, and that apparently this had been going on for months, and that Miriam Chen had heard from someone who had heard from someone else, and Elena said, "I know," though she hadn't. Not with words, only with that deep animal part of her brain that had been trying to tell her for months and which she had consistently, patiently refused to hear. Marcus found her by the fireplace at 10:45. He did not look ashamed. He looked, if anything, slightly inconvenienced, as though her presence at this particular event had introduced an administrative complication into an otherwise well-managed evening. He had the look of a man who had prepared something and was now delivering it on a timeline slightly earlier than intended, and the slight displacement showed only in the almost imperceptible tightening around his jaw, which Elena knew because she had looked at his jaw for 3 years and knew every variation of it. He said her name the way you say the name of a bill you have forgotten to pay. He said, "Elena." And then he said, "I was going to tell you." And then he said the 3 words, the ones she would remember forever, the ones that had the structural properties of a wrecking ball delivered at low velocity, which is to say they did the damage slowly, the way certain things do when they are very heavy. He said, "This is over." Not, "I'm sorry" first, not, "I need to talk to you." Just, "This is over," as though he were closing a tab, settling an account, finishing with something that had served its purpose and now needed to be cleared away to make room. Claudette was standing nearby. She had not been hovering, exactly, but she had been positioned in the way of someone who is interested in a conversation she does not want to appear to be interested in. Elena saw her hear it. She saw the small, vicious upturn at the corner of Claudette's mouth, the flash of satisfaction that comes to people who need others to be small in order to feel large, and she felt the heat of it on her face, like something applied deliberately. A woman nearby in sapphire tulle turned her head fractionally. A man to Elena's left found a reason to look toward the fire. The crowd did not stop, did not gasp, did not make any theatrical acknowledgement of what was happening. It simply absorbed it, the way parties absorb small disasters, by continuing. "You should probably go," Marcus said. "This isn't really your world." He said it quietly. He said it with what she would later recognize was the particular cruelty of someone who has rehearsed a thing until it sounds gentle, until the blade is so well honed that the person being cut does not feel it until they try to move. He said it with his eyes already sliding back toward Vivienne Alcott across the room, the migration of his attention a statement more complete than anything the words had managed. He turned back toward the room, back toward the woman in red who was watching from 30 feet away, with her champagne held loose and her expression cool and appraising, the expression of someone assessing a situation that does not concern them much. And he left Elena standing at the fireplace with the marble at her back and the warmth of the fire on her face and the laughter of 100 people in her ears and $140 of midnight blue dress and no way out of the room that did not pass directly through the crowd of people who had just witnessed every word of it. Claudette turned away, having gotten what she came for. The woman in sapphire tulle found something across the room to be interested in. The man to Elena's left drifted toward the bar, and Elena stood there for exactly as long as it took to make a decision, which was 4 seconds, and the decision was this: she would not run, she would not cry, and she would not give this room the satisfaction of watching her leave as though she had been told to. She walked out. She held her head exactly level. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at Vivienne Alcott. She nodded precisely once to the string quartet as she passed them, and one of the violinists, a young woman with a tired face who had been watching the room all evening with the observant exhaustion of someone paid to be invisible, gave her the smallest, most private nod back. She did not cry until she was in the cab, and the Whitmore house had disappeared from the window behind her. Then she cried for a very long time. Then she stopped. Then something else settled into the place where the crying had been, something very quiet and very cold, and she recognized it, and she let it stay. She went to work the next morning because there was no world in which Elena Vasquez did not go to work the next morning. She had never missed a shift in 4 years. She was not going to start because a man who said, "This is over," like closing a tab, had remembered to use 3 words instead of 2. She washed her face and pulled her hair back, and went to the hospital and walked the wards, and did what she had always done, which was to pay attention to the people who needed it most, and give them whatever she had. She was distributing medication in Ward C when she saw him. Nico was already there, had been there for an hour apparently, sitting beside Mr. Fortunato, who was 91 and lonely in the way that only people who have outlived everyone they ever loved are lonely, which is to say completely, thoroughly, with no bottom to it. Nico was reading to him from a book of maritime history that Mr. Fortunato had specifically requested and which Nico had, Elena realized, gone out and acquired between yesterday and today. Not ordered. Gone and acquired, which meant he had stood in a shop somewhere and found this specific book for this specific old man and brought it here at 7 in the morning as though it were the most natural errand in the world. He looked up when she came in and saw her face, and the book went very quietly into his lap, and he said nothing, asked nothing, but his eyes asked everything, and she gave him the smallest nod, the kind that means, "I'm here and I am not all right and I don't want to talk about it and thank you for seeing it." And he gave her the smallest nod back, the kind that means, "I see you and I'm here and we don't have to talk about anything." And that was the entire conversation, and it was the most she had felt seen in longer than she could accurately measure. She got through the shift. She got through 2 more after that, on the 4th day. Nico said, very quietly, while they were both restocking a supply cart in the corridor, "If you ever want to just walk somewhere and not talk, I'm good at that." She had said, "Tomorrow morning?" And he had said, yes, without hesitation, without checking anything, without any of the gestures people make when they are calculating what it will cost them. They walked for 2 hours along the river path the next morning, and it rained lightly the whole time, and they talked about almost nothing, and Elena felt, for the first time in days, that the floor under her was solid. His phone buzzed 3 times during the walk. He did not look at it once. The days after that had a different quality to them, a texture she had not felt in a long time, something approaching peace, though not the passive peace of resignation, but the active peace of someone who has stopped fighting the wrong things and started simply moving forward. She went to the hospital. She did her work. She ate properly for the first time in a week. She called her mother on Sunday evening and did not mention Marcus and did not need to, because her mother had always known things before Elena said them and said only, "You sound like yourself again," which was, Elena thought, perhaps the most complete sentence anyone had spoken to her in months. She did not tell her mother about Nico. She was not ready to find the words for Nico. She was not sure the words existed yet in any language she spoke fluently. But she thought about him on the walk to work and on the walk home and in the particular quiet of the late ward at the end of a long shift. And she thought about the way certain things become clearer when you stop trying to see them directly and simply let your peripheral vision do its work. The call came on a Thursday. She knew something had changed before he said a word. She had gotten used to Nico's voice the way you get used to weather in a place you live, its textures and its moods, the way warmth sounds in it and tiredness sounds in it, and the particular sound it makes when he is reading to someone old and frightened and trying to give them something steady. She knew his voice. She had not heard this voice before. He said her name, and it had an extra syllable somehow, or perhaps it had exactly the right syllables for the first time, and she had simply never heard the real version before. He said, "Elena, I need to tell you something. I should have told you before. I want to tell you now." She sat down. She did not know why she sat down, only that her body understood that sitting was correct. There was a silence on the line, not an uncomfortable one, but a weighted one. The silence of someone choosing the first word of something they have been preparing for a long time. Then he said, his full name was not Nico. Nico was what he had always been called, what his mother had called him in the private language of their household, the name that was his in all the ways that mattered and none of the ways that appeared on official documents. On official documents his name was longer and older and attached by an unbroken chain of 600 years, to a throne that still existed in a small country whose borders had held through every upheaval of the last 3 centuries by virtue of a combination of geographic stubbornness and diplomatic intelligence that had become, over the generations, almost genetic. He was the second son. He had a brother. His brother would inherit everything that inheritance meant in their context, which was considerable, but which was also a kind of life that Nico had watched from the inside and understood completely and had quietly, deliberately, without drama or rebellion, decided was not sufficient for him. He had wanted to know what he was when the title was removed. He had wanted to know what people were when they did not know what he was. He had been doing this for 8 months, in this city, in this hospital, in this ward, with this teacup. She did not speak at all. When he had finished, she said, "Tell me again." Not because she had not heard, but because she needed to hear it the second time, with her brain engaged rather than just her ears, needed the words to pass through the part of her that processed things rather than just the part that received them. He told her again. The second time it was the same words and a different sound, or she heard it differently, or she was simply more present for it, more braced and therefore more able to receive it without it simply passing through her. She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And he said, "Because I needed to know what you were like when you didn't know who I was." And she sat with that for a moment, the elegant, devastating simplicity of it, the patience it implied, the respect it contained, and then she understood it completely, and it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her in her adult life. She said, "What happens now?" And he said, "Whatever you want. Nothing changes unless you want it to." A silence. Outside her window, the city was doing its enormous, indifferent thing. Inside, something was rearranging itself in a way she could not yet name, but which felt, beneath all the shock and the disorientation, like the arrival of something that had been in transit for a very long time. She said, "Give me until morning." He said, "Take whatever you need." She hung up and sat in the dark with the phone in her lap for a very long time. She thought about the teacup. She thought about Mrs. Adeyemi's chair. She thought about Mr. Fortunato and the maritime history book. She thought about a walk in the rain where a phone had buzzed 3 times unanswered. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who had no obligation to see you, who was not seeing you because you were useful or decorative or strategically positioned, but simply because you were there and you were worth seeing. She thought about Marcus and, "This isn't really your world." And she thought about how the cruelty of that sentence was not in its intention, but in its assumption, the assumption that the world was a fixed and sorted thing with designated places, and that she had been correctly sorted into hers. She sat in the dark for a long time, and she decided something. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a great resolution, just quietly and completely, the way you decide to keep something you have been carrying when you finally understand that you have been carrying it all along, and that the carrying has made you stronger rather than heavier. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning she made coffee and stood at the window, and 3 black vehicles turned onto her street, and she understood that she had already decided before she heard them coming. What happened next arrived before Elena had fully assembled her understanding of what Nico had told her on the phone, which is to say it arrived on Friday morning in the form of 3 black vehicles that turned onto her street with the unhurried authority of objects that have never in their operational history been asked to hurry, because the world simply rearranges itself to accommodate them. They were long and black and spotless in a way that suggested they were never permitted to be anything else, and they moved together in a formation that was not aggressive, but was entirely unambiguous about where they were going and the weight of the intention behind the going. The street, which was a perfectly ordinary street that Elena had lived on for 4 years without incident, seemed to compress slightly under the arrival, the way a stage changes when a significant performer walks out onto it. Not visibly but atmospherically, the whole space reorganized around a new center of gravity. Elena was at her window with her coffee when they pulled up, and she watched the middle vehicle stop directly below her apartment, and she watched the door open, and she watched Nico step out. He was wearing something she had never seen before, and yet she recognized it immediately as the thing that had been underneath the sweaters all along, the thing the sweaters had been covering, not hiding exactly, but protecting, keeping private, keeping for the right moment. The jacket was charcoal and perfectly structured, and it moved with him with the ease of something built specifically for his body by someone who understood bodies the way a marine architect understands hulls. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up at her window with an expression that was entirely Nico, the same warm, dark eyes, the same steadiness, and also entirely something else, something vast and patient that had been waiting backstage while the man in the worn sweaters went quietly about the work of seeing who she was. The man at his right hand was large and contained in the way of someone trained to be a landscape rather than a figure, present but unobtrusive until the moment presence and obtrusiveness become identically necessary. He stood one step back and to the right, and scanned the street with the automatic thoroughness of someone for whom streets are never just streets, but environments to be read, assessed, and managed. A second man stood at the lead vehicle's door with the same posture, the same scan. The concierge of her building, a man named Gerald, who had once told her that her package deliveries were an imposition on the lobby aesthetic, and who had never once held the door open for her in 4 years of daily passage, was standing on the front steps with his hand on the door handle, looking at the vehicles with the expression of a person who is rapidly revising every assumption he has ever held about everything, including himself. She thought about not going down. She sat with her coffee and she thought about the enormous machinery of what Nico had told her, and she thought about all the ways in which her life was a specific size and shape that fit specific spaces, and she thought about the cost of stepping into something that had no ceiling and no map. She thought about Mrs. Adeyemi's empty chair and the flowers Nico had brought for it. She thought about Mr. Fortunato and the maritime history book acquired before 7 in the morning for a 91-year-old man who had nothing to give in return except his company. She thought about Marcus saying, "This is over, and this isn't really your world." She thought about the cold thing that had settled in her chest afterward, in the cab, and she thought about how that cold thing had not gone anywhere, had simply become very patient, had been waiting for its proper use. She put down her coffee. She went to her closet. She chose carefully. Not the midnight blue of the Harrington Gala, not the dress worn to someone else's event in someone else's world. Not the garment she had pressed and altered to be acceptable to a room that had already decided about her before she walked through the door. Something she had bought for herself, before any of this, before Marcus, before Priya and Whitmore House and the woman in red. Something she had bought one afternoon because it was exactly the color of the river in autumn, and she had loved it without any context or occasion and never found the occasion. She found it now. She put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not evaluating, not rehearsing, just looking, the way you look at a map before a journey, taking one clear fixed bearing. And then she picked up her bag and walked out of the apartment and down the stairs and out into the Friday morning where 3 black vehicles and one extraordinarily patient man were waiting on her sidewalk. Gerald held the door. He did not speak. She did not acknowledge him. Nico looked at her and smiled. Not the polished smile of someone who smiles for rooms, but the real one. The one she knew. The warm, dark-eyed one that had been exactly itself, whether he was sitting in a hospital ward or standing on a sidewalk in front of a motorcade. And he said, "You didn't have to come." And she said, "I know." And they both laughed, a small, private laugh, the callback of it landing between them like something landing home. She got into the car. The door closed behind her with the specific, definitive sound of something very well made. The thing about watching someone who has always been kind reveal that they have also always been powerful is that you understand, retroactively, that the kindness was never accidental and never small. It was a choice, made every day by someone who did not have to make it. Elena understood this as the motorcade moved through the city with the unhurried certainty of something that has never once been stuck in traffic because the city simply opens for it, the way water parts for something that moves with sufficient calm authority. She understood it when they arrived at the Meridian, not the Harrington Gala with its golden light and its marble appraising machine, but the Meridian, which occupied an address that existed on city maps with the quiet confidence of something that does not need to announce itself, its facade clean and severe and old in the way that only things built by people who assumed their permanence are old. There was no gold light here, no theatrical illumination designed to impress. Just pale stone that had been pale stone for a very long time and intended to remain so. She understood it when the doors opened before they reached them, not opened by a person pressing a button, simply opened, as though the building itself had been attending to their approach. She understood it when they walked through a lobby in which every person they passed responded to Nico, not with the performance of deference, the slight overdone bow, the careful extra effort of the person remembering to be impressive, but with the simple, practiced, unthinking fluency of people for whom his presence was part of the architecture of their professional world. It was the difference between someone saying, "Good morning, sir," because they had been told to, and someone saying it the way you say good morning to the sun. And then she understood it most precisely when they arrived at the room where Marcus was waiting. He was there because Nico had arranged for him to be there, not to be cruel, but because Elena had one thing she needed to say, and she needed him to hear it in a room he could not leave, a room that was not his, a room in which the geometry of power had already been established by the time he walked in, and found it rearranged around someone he had believed had nothing. He had been told only that there was a meeting, and that his presence was required, and that it pertained to the Alcott acquisition, and that description had been sufficient to bring him, because Marcus had never once in his professional life failed to attend something that pertained to the Alcott acquisition. He was standing near the window when they entered, with the posture of a man who expects to be the most important person in a room. He saw Elena first, and his face arranged itself into the expression it wore when she was inconveniencing him. A slight forward set of the brow, a compression of the mouth, the expression of someone who has a great deal to do and very little patience for interruptions. Then he saw the room itself, the quality of it, the silence in it. Then he saw the men in the lobby visible through the glass, the vehicles at the curb, the way even the furniture seemed to have arranged itself around Nico, with a deference that was architectural rather than performed. And his face did something quite different, something that started as recalibration and became, very quickly, something more fundamental and more uncomfortable. The brow unknit, the mouth opened fractionally. The colour, already pale in the morning light, went paler. Claudette was there too, because she had come with Marcus, because apparently their social world was smaller than it liked to believe, and she went very still in the way of someone whose cataloguing system has just encountered an entry it cannot file. She looked at Nico. She looked at the room. She looked at Elena. She looked at Nico again. The calculus behind her eyes was almost audible. Elena looked at them both. She did not rush. She stood in the room, and she let the silence do what silence does when it is not filled, which is to clarify everything. She thought about, "This is over." She thought about, "This isn't really your world." She said very quietly, with the cold thing finding its proper use at last, "I came to return something." She reached into her bag and set the ring. Marcus's ring. a ring she had been wearing for 8 months, on the table between them. It sat there in the light. Small, final. She said, "You were right, it was over. You just didn't know what was ending." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was already doing what rooms do when they contain something too large for their usual purposes. Claudette made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of a woman whose entire operating system has just been informed that the user it was built for is not the correct user. Marcus looked at Nico with the expression of a man recalculating the value of everything he thought he owned, everything he thought he had won, everything he had measured himself against and found sufficient, and finding that every number in the calculation was wrong. Nico said nothing. He simply stood beside Elena with the patient, unhurried presence of a mountain that has been there long before anyone arrived and will be there long after they leave. Then Nico spoke quietly to the large contained man at his right, and the large contained man stepped forward and made a call. A single brief call, 30 seconds at most. He did not raise his voice. He was not speaking to Marcus. He was simply completing an action that had already been decided, in the way of someone reading a conclusion that was written before the meeting began. When the call was finished, the large man looked at Marcus and said, in the pleasant, neutral voice of someone delivering a weather forecast, that the Alcott account had been reviewed, and that certain representations made during the acquisition process had been found to be materially inaccurate, and that Mr. Harrington, who was the host of the gala, and also, as it happened, the chairman of the Oversight Board, had been made aware of the specific nature of those inaccuracies, and that the board would be meeting on Monday to determine next steps, and that Marcus would be receiving a formal letter by close of business today. He said it the way you say these things when they are already done, when the phone call was the formality and not the action, when the action was completed at some earlier hour by people in other rooms who had already moved on to other matters. Marcus sat down. He did not choose to. His legs simply made the decision for him. He sat in the chair behind him and looked at the ring on the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. And understanding this, finally, was perhaps the most self-aware moment of his adult life. Claudette looked at the ring on the table for a long time, and then looked at the door, and then left without speaking, which was, Elena thought, perhaps the first genuinely self-aware thing she had ever seen the woman do. Her footsteps crossed the lobby below. A door opened and closed. And then the room was very quiet, and the ring sat on the table, and Marcus sat in the chair, and the city went about its business outside the windows. And it was enough. And so, in the end, the world did not shake. It did not shatter dramatically or crash with the sound of something large falling. It simply rearranged. This is what power actually does when it is wielded by someone who has learned it from the inside, who has held it long enough to know that the loudest version of it is always the weakest version of it. Elena Vasquez stood in the quiet of what had just happened and felt the cold thing in her chest complete its purpose and dissolve, leaving behind something warmer and more permanent, something she had no word for yet, but which she was confident she would find in time, in the way you find words for things when you have stopped being afraid of them. They walked back through the lobby. The building did not hold its breath. It simply continued, as buildings do, as old permanent things do, because old permanent things have seen more dramatic exits than this one, and will see more after, and have long since stopped making note. In the car on the way home, Nico said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." And she said, "You told me when I needed to know." And he said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "Ask me tomorrow." And he said, "Every day after that too." And she looked at him in the particular way that means yes without using the word. And that was enough. And the city moved past the windows the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and entirely unaware that something had just been settled inside it that had been unsettled for a very long time. There was a conversation she had with Nico that evening, in her apartment, at the small table where he had sat 6 weeks ago cradling a teacup, that she would never entirely be able to reconstruct from memory, because the parts of it that mattered were not in the words, but in the spaces between them. He told her what the coming months would look like. She told him what she was, and was not willing to do with the coming months. They disagreed on 2 things, and agreed on 5, and set aside 3 for later, and none of it felt like negotiation, and all of it felt like the kind of conversation that is only possible between people who have already decided that the conversation is worth having. He told her that his family would want to meet her. She told him that she had met difficult people before and had survived them through the straightforward method of being entirely herself and refusing to apologize for it. He looked at her with the warm, dark eyes and said, "That is exactly the right answer." And she said, "I know." And they both smiled, and the city went on outside the window, and the rain started again, and the teacup sat on the counter where it had always sat, cheap and sturdy and exactly sufficient for its purpose. And she thought that there was something instructive in that, and she filed it away for later. Marcus lost the account. He lost the Alcott connection. He lost several other things that do not need to be named here, because they were always going to be lost once the foundation beneath them was shown to be what it was. Claudette lost 3 clients who, upon reflection, found her services no longer suited to their needs, and a 4th who had not been paying close attention until a mutual acquaintance mentioned the Meridian, and then paid very close attention indeed. Vivian Alcott moved on to the next project with the efficiency of someone who has never permitted sentiment to interfere with portfolio management. These things happened in the background, quietly, proportionally, with the merciless arithmetic of consequence that has no interest in drama, and is all the more devastating for it. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like accuracy. It felt like the world correcting an error in the calculation, restoring a value that had been entered wrong. Elena went back to the hospital because she loved the hospital, because the work was real, and the need was real, and she was good at it, and no motorcade or Meridian address or title attached to a 600-year-old chain of paperwork changes the value of a person who shows up for the frightened and the lonely and the sick at 7 a.m. every day without being asked twice. She brought flowers for Mrs. Adeyemi's chair on the anniversary of her passing, which Nico had remembered without being reminded, and they stood in the quiet ward together. And Mr. Fortunato, who was now 92 and considerably further into the maritime history series, looked up from his book and watched them stand there and said nothing, because he was 92 and understood what silence was for. She thought about the kind of person who notices what other people stop seeing, who stays when there is no obligation to stay, who brings flowers for an empty chair. She thought about teacups. She thought about the first clue and all the clues that followed and the patience required to lay them out without knowing if they would ever be understood. And she thought that this was, in the end, the whole story, not the motorcade or the ring on the table or the 30-second phone call that rearranged a man's entire professional world, but this, a person who notices, a person who stays, a person who brings flowers for an empty chair. If you have been waiting for permission to stop making yourself small to fit spaces that were built by people who measured worth in the wrong units, consider this your permission. The people who need you to be less so they can be more are not your people. Your people are the ones who see you when you believe you are invisible, who show up when it costs them something, who set their phones down. The world has a great deal to say about who belongs where. The world is frequently, spectacularly wrong. The story you just heard is proof. Like and share if you believe that what you are on the inside is the only currency that matters. And if someone in your life has ever made you feel like this isn't your world, I want you to remember Elena at the window with her coffee and the 3 black vehicles arriving for her, only her, in the Friday morning rain. The world belongs to those who were built for it on the inside. You are already there. You just haven't received the motorcade yet.